Welcome to the new series of Speak Up, the television and social media platform for Freemasonry in New Zealand. I am Barry Ruston, your host, and thank you for joining us this evening. From the sunny Bay of Plenty, our first guest is Wayne Marriott. That's 2 R's and 2 T's. When it comes to our heritage, our genealogy, our history here in New Zealand, you will find Wayne right at the forefront. Our second guest tonight is Simon Black, and unfortunately, it will be me, an IT dummy, talking to an IT expert. However, this man is not stuck behind a computer all the time. He also runs to the top of the Sky Tower with a full fireman's kit to raise funds for charity. He's a great bloke. Now, closing out the show, of course, is our regular contributor, Graeme Houston, who talks about a former governor of New Zealand, Sir Cyral Newall, another prominent Freemason. What a pleasure it is to have this week with us Wayne Marriott from the sunny Bay of Plenty. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
And thanks for coming all that way. That's a beautiful area, your area.
It's a fantastic place.
Now listen, before we start, if that's okay, I'd just like to read something to our audience because it gives us the picture, it sums everything up. I'll rattle through it pretty quickly so I don't leave you sitting there, okay? But this is what was read by when the national government were in, and the Minister for Arts and Culture, I think it was Maggie Barry, she said about you in 2015 when you were appointed to the board of the New Zealand and the Maori Heritage Council. She said, you have extensive experience in the heritage sector. You're a council member of the New Zealand Society of Genealogists, Vice President of the Whakatane and District Historical Society, and Trustee for the Whakatane Historical Society Scholarship Trust, have led museum projects in Southland, Nelson, Wellington, and obviously Whakatane, and also you're a former head of operations in the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar. That is remarkable. I mean, how did you get this history bug? Where did it all start from?
Well, for me, I was very lucky. I mean, I grew up in Ashburton, so great country town as it was. It was a rural service centre in those days. Now it's become a lot larger than the town I originally grew up in. I was fortunate. I had grandparents, great-grandparents, lots of great-great-aunts and uncles who used to sit there and tell you stories. You didn't really know you were being told stories in those days. You were the nosy kid that was earwigging. Yeah. And so by earwigging, you suddenly met people who'd been in the Boer War, the last of the First World War survivors. And then obviously people that served in World War II were just a dime a dozen in those days. Mm-hmm. Now they're in the same situation as the people who I first met who served in the Boer War.
When you were 16, something happened when you were 16?
Well, at 16, I got elected to what's known as the board of the Ashburton Historical Society. They were a scary group of people in those days. Most of them had either taught my mother or my father, and in one case, I think one had even taught one of my grandmothers. So, I think I dropped the average age overnight from about 90-something down to 37.5 or 6. But that actually gave me the chance to get to understand and see how a small museum actually worked, and I didn't know at that stage that would end up being my career. So I guess that interest in humanity and social history was really my driver. So you could go off to university, you could study English history, whatever. I chose to focus on New Zealand history, and that's something that I've always enjoyed. Mum and Dad backed me into a business, which was really the start of the opportunity to do some networking, and then from there it was into a dealer gallery where I got to work. Even though I was based in Dunedin, I worked throughout the country for a number of the corporates in the early 90s, developing corporate art collections. Right. And that was a huge start and a way to meet a number of amazing New Zealand artists. I mean, there were people, for example, you'd be dealing with Tos Wollaston or Doris Last, names now that the young artists and art historians coming through just can't believe that somebody actually had the chance to even sell on their behalf. Ralph Huteri, Marilyn Webb, all of those guys were part of a wonderful cache of about 100 and plus artists this particular gallery had. Then I was asked if I wanted to actually take on a museum, and so John Coley, who was the director of the Robert McDougall Art Gallery in Christchurch at that stage, had done a review on Southland. Southland had the Southland Museum and Art Gallery. It was quite an old institution. They'd never had a person in charge of art before. So I was the initial appointee, became one of the founding trustees of the Southland Art Foundation, and from there the career blossomed.
At the age of?
I was probably about 23, 24.
That's fantastic.
So it was wonderful.
But then while you were doing that, weren't you suddenly plucked or called, and you eventually ended up, or not eventually, but you were called to do head of operations at the Islamic Museum in Qatar, in Doha.
Yep.
And, how did a Kiwi lad get from Southland or Wellington or wherever you were at the time to Qatar?
Well, it starts off with a number of processes. While I was living in Southland, I was received a Winston Churchill Fellowship.
That's right.
So I went overseas and I actually studied the first known European family, as they were termed, living in New Zealand. And it was a case of trying to identify who they were.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a date of around 1795. We found the mum, dad and a number of kids. So I was pulling that information together. Part of that research led me to London, where I looked at the people who were actually shipwrecked in Dusky Sound at that stage, and started working in Grand Lodge in Holborn, going through the big volumes at that stage, looking for those who were in the various lodges in India, in Lodge Bengal in particular, trying to work out if in fact there was the potential of one of the earliest lodge meetings not actually being in the Bay of Islands, but potentially in Dusky Sound in 1795. Now that will make a few people sit there and blink their eyes and think, what the heck's going on? So I started on that research, came back to New Zealand, eventually ended up in a role in Wellington where I started the MBA, completed that, got to Nelson and worked on the development of the Nelson Provincial Museum. So we took what was an old institution out in Stoke, brought it back into the centre of town, using the excuse, and it was an excuse at the time, that we were on the corner of Hardy and Trafalgar Street in Nelson, so it was perfect Battle of Trafalgar, and we were heading towards 2005, which was the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. So all the stars aligned, we were able to do that. One of the things that occurred during that was a visit from the American Embassy, and suddenly I had this invitation to become part of the International Visitor Program, which the US State Department puts on. So I headed to the States, did the research, was part of the team, got back to New Zealand, and probably it was about 12 months later I got a phone call one day asking me if I'd be interested in this role that was in Sharjah, which is actually in the UAE. I went to the interview, and while I'm sitting in this interview, left it, my phone rang, and it was somebody ringing from Doha. And I thought, how do they know I'm here, and where is Doha?
Yeah,
that was the first thing you're not quite sure. So the result was that I actually flew to London the next morning, had an interview the following day, and was appointed head of operations to the Museum of Islamic Art. Now, in a 24-hour research space, you suddenly realise that here was going to be one of the most amazing, iconic buildings of the 21st century being built in Doha. It had its own island. The architect was I.M. Pei. He's just passed away. I think he was 101 or 102 when he just died. Amazing man, designed the glass pyramid over the Louvre. And to be able to be given that opportunity to work with a team of people like him was just incredible. So I came back to New Zealand. I'd actually been offered a role with Historic Places Trust as it was at that stage. So suddenly the world turned around. I resigned from the job I was about to start on the Monday. Then 4 weeks later headed into the Middle East and started working on that project. Came back to New Zealand after my role was completed, and then started work on two other museum projects here.
Is that when you started with that, what they called the first living building?
Tūhoe have this interesting habit where you're invited for a cup of tea. So I was a bit naive. I didn't understand that a cup of tea meant there's something we would like you to have a look at and see. So the result was that we had the opportunity to have a concept with Ivan Mersep, who had been engaged by Tūhoe to actually work on the first living building challenge. It was an amazing project. My part was quite a small part of it, looking primarily at the library and the archive side to ensure that Tūhoe had post-settlement the right facilities going forward to be able to preserve their material.
Totally self-sufficient, isn't it?
What's wonderful about it is not only the fact that here was this great New Zealand architect, Ivan Mersep, and the saddest part was that Ivan didn't live to see the building actually opened, but it was the vision from Tūhoe which I think threw everybody completely, and especially from their chair, Tamati Kruger, and their chief executive, Kirsty Luke, who were prepared to get in along with the other board members and champion something that was so left field it was not funny. That is something I think that we need to do with a lot more of our architecture in New Zealand, because when people go there, they are completely blown away by the vision, and the brightness of what that particular building does. It's fantastic.
It's sensational.
Really good.
Now, amongst all that, of course, is that you're actually writing a book, right? And you've got yourself you're close to finishing?
No, I wish. Well, I'd like to say I'm close to finishing.
So the name of your book, I believe, or the title of your book, is The History of Electrification in Eastern Bay of Plenty.
That's correct.
Seems a lofty title, but it sounds great.
It's a very lofty title. What it basically means is that I'm looking at the history of the current Horizon Energy and the Horizon Energy Group. That dates back all the way through to the development of two particular places, the Bay of Plenty Electric Power Board and also the Whakatane MED. So you had two organisations, both starting really post-World War I, coming all the way through, and eventually they amalgamated. So it's looking at the fights, the debates, the competition. It's been very interesting to look at, because something that I've been able to take it through into another area was specifically getting down to the Freemasons involved. Now, if you go to the original board and you have a look at the original staff members, well, all were members of the Lodge of Portuguese, English Constitution.
Wow.
If you then come across and look at the Whakatane one, they were members of Whakatane Lodge 198, including the Master, who happened to be Mayor. Let's just say there was a lot of competition going on between the English Constitution and the New Zealand Constitution, which probably wasn't seen as de rigueur at that time, but it was certainly about protecting your own patch. And eventually, after a number of years, both of those organisations have amalgamated. At the moment, where I'm the stage I am in writing is up to 1940, so with the emergency war regulations and all of that coming through. For me, as somebody who's never really been the great science graduate or anything like that, it's absolutely fascinating to look at it, but also taking it very much from the social history, looking at the individuals behind it and learning a lot more about the people who are working.
Now in Whakatane, the lodge, how many lodges in Whakatane? Just the one or the two?
Just one now,
Just two.
Yes.
And so community activities. I believe you've done something recently that, as part of your community, you'd like to show us and tell us about that?
So back in 2015, there were the Edgecombe floods, and the quite significant floods around the Eastern Bay of Plenty. We have the Acacia Charitable Trust, which is a group of appointees by the District Grand Master of the Bay of Plenty area. So we looked and thought, what could we do? And we realised that for many people, their homes have been flooded, they lost many of their possessions. We got a call, and it was simply a case of help. There was a lady who had one photograph album, and that one photograph album had the only photographs of her son that had passed away in it. And it was, what can I do? She went to a local business. They said $25 per photograph, and we will copy these for you. Whoa. Now, you're in the middle of a natural disaster. Yeah. It's no fault of your own. So what we did was we actually put our heads together and said, how can we help? So having worked within the cultural heritage sector, we had access to very good photographers. So we tracked down a brilliant photographer here in Auckland, and we gave him the job, and we said, right, we need you to come and work with our community. He had a background in forensic photography and the police, so he knew how to handle a lot of this stuff. And so we pulled together the various lodges, and there were the three in the area at that stage, and said, we need your help. So they marshalled the people. There was the slow capture digitisation process, and after about 12 months, because it did take 12 months to do, we had captured over 150,000 photographs and negatives which had been flooded during that process. So everybody received one of these.
That's fantastic.
All of their photographs were on the memory stick, which was labelled as from Freemasons New Zealand, but where we were coming from was simply, this is something that we could do. It gave people back hope, it gave them their pride. Certainly it helped in terms of mental health, because for one man in particular, he brought in 13,000 photographs. And we were a bit stunned when they started coming in. He had only moved very recently into the Edgecombe area, so he was the family genealogist, and so he had all the original family photos back to the 1860s. Wow. They were all in the plastic tubs. They were sitting in the basement, and as the water came up, it went into the plastic tubs and simply filled.
Wow. And you managed to save all of those?
So we probably copied about 85 to 90% of what he had. So he actually had a record of everything. So they were all backed up, and I thought that was one way that any community group could sit there and make a real contribution back to that community. So,
Wayne, thank you for coming tonight. And folks,
thank you very much.
If you're down in the Bay of Plenty, stop by Wayne's place. It's called Art Naked. Is that right? It's an art gallery.
It is indeed.
And I've seen it on the web, and it looks fantastic. So if you're down in that area, Wakatani, pop in and say hello to Wayne. Thanks again for coming all the way.
You're welcome. Cheers. Right, it's great.
It is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the show Simon Black. Simon, great to see you all the way from Wellington. Fantastic.
Thanks,
right?
Barry.
You're involved with, I hate to say it, but IT, right?
I am.
Look, I have to admit right up front that I am so computer illiterate. When someone says they're in IT, if someone says they're a software developer or a software writer, there's a big glaze that goes right over my eyes, you know. But I know that your company is going from strength to strength. Tell us about your company and what's happening.
Oh, well, look, we had a dream. I had a dream years and years ago. I used to work in the corporates, and I thought, well, actually, there's one piece of software left in me, and I'd like to do it for myself.
Correct.
And so 10 years ago, I started a web company called Webs, and then moved into the commercial side of things called New Wave. And what we did is that we thought, let's try and solve one of the big problems in the country at the moment, and that was building consent submissions.
Building?
Consent submissions.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes,
yeah.
you know, electronically submitting building consents to your council. And
Wow.
so we partnered with a company called Master Business Systems and Fielding, and together we actually had the whole end-to-end solution. So what we did is we formed a joint venture,
Wow.
went for some government tenders and won those. And now what we're doing is we've delivered this building consent portal to 10 councils, and hopefully within the next 12 months we'll get another 10 on board. And also we're starting to get into the central government side of things as well. So you know, we're just starting to get that traction there, which is good.
That sounds fantastic, because I know you hear it day after day that people want to do something, they want to build an extra room on their house, and to get the consent and the time that it takes seems like forever.
It does.
So if you're doing something to speed this up, that's got to be great.
It does. Well, the feedback we're getting at the moment is excellent.
Great. You know. So how many councils around the country are there? Are there hundreds?
About 72.
72?
Yeah.
Wow. Surely, I won't say like the dominoes, but if one council starts seeing how effective this is working, I'm sure you're hoping that most of them will.
Correct, that's right. We're starting to get that recognition and momentum. I think councils are a little bit hesitant of taking on new technology. Once they see it working and working well, then all of a sudden they're starting to get on board now. So we're looking at getting an uptake this year, and the whole team itself is doing a good job.
That's fantastic. Now I know that like a lot of people, there are lots of influences in families, and I believe your father had a great influence on you,
Huge.
right? I mean, he said a couple of things to you when you were quite young, right? That have stayed with you for all of your life. In actual fact, you use part of them constantly. Is that correct?
I do.
What were the couple of things that your dad did say to you?
Well, the two things that he presented to me, and I knew he's a Freemason, but I didn't know really what he did. From a young age, he had these apron, and he went to meetings and stuff like that, and I didn't really know what that was all about. But the things he did say to me is, read this, and it was the four-way test in Rotary.
Right.
And also there was a poem called If by Rudyard Kipling, also another,
another Freemason.
Could be well-known Freemason.
Now, of course, you say you fell over your father's suitcase, right? So I believe that you and your brother just started walking around playing with these.
Oh,
with these
that's right.
things.
Yeah. So when Dad wasn't looking, it's like Freemasonry in those days were like hush hush. So Dad would go to these meetings. So Dad was actually quite open about his Freemasonry, and then there's this apron and these this collar there, and they had these gloves, white gloves there, and we'd put that on, and they had this blue book. I don't know what was all in there. There's all half of it was missing. So but we didn't know what it was, but it was actually quite intriguing. All these meetings. Yeah.
Now I know that there's another part of your life which, apart from Freemasonry, that you really do enjoy as well, and that's the community service that you give under the Fire and Emergency New Zealand.
Oh yes,
right?
absolutely.
Tell us a little bit why you enjoy that. There's lots of different community activities that you could join. Why has this one put a nice little sort of string to your heart?
I think these two organisations, Freemasonry and the New Zealand Fire Service, so as it is now, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, huge similarities for me.
Yeah.
They've got charity and community at the heart. They've got trust between the team and members. You've got the fraternity or the camaraderie and fellowship between the people there, the closeness in it. Yeah. And a lot of people don't realise that about 85% of Fire and Emergency New Zealand are volunteers.
Fantastic, isn't it?
So there's some huge similarities there.
Now, you do some personal things yourself, right? I mean,
Yes.
I believe you're in the Sky Challenge.
I do.
And going
I do.
to do it next year.
I'm going to do it next year as well. Yes.
Tell us what motivates you to do that. What's the purpose? I mean, what's the cause that you support?
Leukemia and Blood Cancer New Zealand, they run this event called Sky Tower Stair Challenge, and so that's directed at the firemen of the country. And so I think this year it was about 1,000 firemen got to walk up the tower and get sponsored to do that, so it's up to them to go out and find sponsorship.
You just don't run up in your jockey shorts, right? You've got to lay yourself down with stuff, correct? Tell us how it starts and what do you do?
Yes, well, the challenge is that you've actually got to walk up the Sky Tower in all your fire kit.
Boom.
Yeah, so it's our structural firefighting kit. It weighs about 10 kilograms in itself. Then you put a BA on as well. So last year, or this year actually, I did
BA, breathing apparatus.
Breathing apparatus.
Okay.
So I used.
Got to break these down.
That's
for
right.
BA,
yeah. So I did the firefighter steel challenge, which I wore a steel cylinder, which is about 18 kgs.
Wow.
And then you got your firefighting kit,
Yeah.
and it doesn't let heat come in, but also doesn't let heat go out. And so I did that 60 floors in 18 minutes.
Fantastic.
So it was a great psychological and fitness challenge as well.
So the obvious question is, of course, once you got to the top, I hope there was a beer there or something, was there for you? Nothing like
big
that?
glass of water.
You must have been absolutely, well, I take that back. You must have known that you did the job.
Did the job, yeah. I was very happy actually.
Tell us how your lungs were feeling and tell us how you felt.
Not too bad. I think I did the right training beforehand,
Right.
and you get to the top, you feel exhausted, but you feel also euphoric as well about it. So,
I bet you do.
yes.
I bet you do. But Simon, it's been great having you on. Much
Thank you, Barry.
success with your company. I know it's going great, and really look forward to seeing you up the Sky Tower.
Thanks, Barry.
mate. Graeme, good to see you again. I know you've got someone really special to tell us about today. So looking forward to it, my friend.
Thank you, Barry. Yes, today we're going to talk about a former Governor-General of New Zealand. His name was Sir Cyral Newall. He was Governor-General from 1941 to 1946, but he was a guy with an interesting background. He was born into a military family, both mother and father. He was educated at the Royal College, Military College at Sandhurst, and he was in two branches of the armed forces, the Army and the Air Force. He learned to fly about 1911, and that saw his passion for flying, so that he ended up joining the Air Force. And in the Bomber Command, and after a series of relatively quick promotions, he found himself, after a number of years, as the Air Chief Marshal of the Royal Air Force. He was considered by some historians as to not be the most gifted of the candidates that they had to consider. However, he got the job. And one of the conflicts that was happening at that stage, about 1936, 1937, was the cabinet, the British cabinet, couldn't decide exactly where the money or the development should be going. Was it into the Bomber Command or was it into the Fighter Strike Force? He, being a bomber from the Bomber Command, was flexible enough to say, well, there has to be both. And he saw the Fighter Force, and particularly the new development of the Hurricane and the Spitfire, that he spent money extensively on the development of the Hurricane and Spitfire and on building the aircraft, which was probably just as well, given the Battle of Britain was just around the corner.
Proved right, wasn't it, in the end?
The Battle of Britain was basically the end of Cyral Newall. He was relieved of that position in about 1940-41, and officially it was said that overwork, tired, and time that he retired. Several historians said, no, that's not true. You were fired. You were fired. And there was a disagreement amongst some of the hierarchy, political intrigue, and out of that, he lost the confidence of Winston Churchill. Now, like a lot of people in those positions, what happens when you fire someone like that?
Go.
He was appointed as Governor-General of New Zealand by
We'll get
Winston
as
Churchill.
far away as we can, right?
He caused no problems. So between 1941 and 1946, he became the Governor-General of New Zealand. Now, he travelled extensively throughout New Zealand during that time. And in fact, one biographer said that it was for Newall, it was one nice long break.
Was it?
And he spent the rest of the war in New Zealand. As I said, he travelled extensively and he spoke wherever he went, but mainly about the war. Was he popular? Well, the consensus seems to be that he was generally popular, although he did have one or two issues along the line. Now, here is a couple of things. He did not have a great relationship with Peter Fraser, who was the Prime Minister at the time in New Zealand. They worked well together, but I think there was not the full level of trust that they may have had. His first little run-in with Peter Fraser was in 1942, and in 1942 he reprimanded the Prime Minister. That was when Newall was presented with a petition from Peter Fraser to remit the sentences of 4 prisoners who were sentenced to be flogged.
I thought that went out with the Dark Ages flogging.
Well, that crossed my mind when I read it.
Yeah.
In fact, I read it from 2 or 3 different sources, flogging, because like you, I thought that went out. They gave the petition to the Governor-General for him to sign and commute the sentences. But Newall refused. He said no. Basically, he said, you always come and ask for these sentences to be remitted. I refuse. If the law is so bad, change the law. There was a stalemate, an impasse happened, and Peter Fraser and Walter Nash said they weren't going to do anything. And so Newall wasn't going to do anything. So there was an impasse for a few days. Eventually, a compromise was received. That was that Newall would commute the sentences or remit the sentences for the flogging of those 4 guys, but the government undertook to repeal the act that allowed for flogging. And whilst they did that, the following year, they also included capital punishment. So capital punishment and flogging went out of the act.
Did he become a Grand Master of New Zealand?
He became Grand Master of New Zealand, and whilst he was here, and was involved with Freemasonry whilst he was in New Zealand. Because he was a Freemason when he did come to New Zealand, part of the English Constitution. He had been initiated into Lodge Antiquity in the number 2 in the English Constitution in October 1940. So he was another Freemason involved in shaping New Zealand, and certainly I think that confrontation helped change the way that we view a number of things today when it comes to the way that we treat people for crimes and things of similar nature. He's not one of the Governor-Generals that really stand out in the mind of everybody, but he was one that in his own way had quite an influence during his time here in New Zealand. Yeah. And another person, another Freemason, which has been involved in the development of New Zealand society as we know it today.
Another great choice, Graeme. You always have to find these great, interesting people, mate. Keep it up.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Graeme. Well, that's our show for this week. Don't forget, if you'd like to know more about Freemasonry, and you won't find it in a Dan Brown's book, but you will by going to the Grand Lodge website, which is freemasonsnz.org. In the meantime, if you've been thinking, planning, or asking questions about joining Freemasonry, we have a website for this very purpose. It's simply welcometofreemasonry.co.nz. We hold a regular dinner experience where you can meet other Freemasons before making a decision to join. So once again, thanks for joining us. See you next week.